Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, KENSHO Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, in honor of Thanksgiving in the US, we're going to explore the concept of American classical music in a series of 3 interviews with American composers. First, I will talk to Jennifer HIGDON, then Will speak to DAMIEN Jeter, and finally, Tiffany will be talking to JEROD TATE. In each of these discussions, we'll try to divine and define just what is American classical music. But before all of that, we'll start with our prelude segment. So Will, what do you have today?
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, 2 Truths and a Lie. We're going to do things a little differently with this game today. Rather than choosing 2 works by the same composer, with one outlier to be divined, in keeping with our theme, I've chosen 3 excerpts that all purport to be American. You know how the rest of this works. In a sinister ploy, one of the excerpts that I will play for you is in fact not American at all, and it will be up to you to try to discern which one that is. Before we get to the excerpts at hand, you know, the 3 of us have spent a lot of time this week reflecting on what makes American music sound American. So what kinds of things are you guys going to be listening for?
Well, as ever, there are a lot of different threads which we're excited to share with our listeners today to what makes music American. But I think we can go with a sort of not to cast aspersions, but a sort of like vanilla description of the open American sound a la Copeland, right? So Fanfare for a Common Man, Appalachian Spring. You know, I mean, I'm thinking like lots of colors of percussion and the sort of open intervals and the sort of fresh feeling to the orchestration and the mood for music.
Yeah, and also I think you touched on it already, Tiffany, a little bit, but with percussion, I think there's certain rhythmic qualities of American music that we can probably relate to kind of dance music. I'm thinking about Bernstein, West Side Story. Those kind of things can also be...
And it's important to trace that back also because we're going to reference jazz and its predecessors as well in defining what American music is. I mean, we know, for example, that the African-American contribution to the early American classical music landscape derives mostly from how important their music was to dance in the United States, especially in antebellum and Civil War era music.
All right, guys. Well, I'm about to throw you guys a little bit of a curveball here because all of the excerpts that we are going to listen to are, in fact, wind ensemble pieces.
There is a large void in my brain for this category.
Well, you know, and that's part of the idea here is to take you out of your normal listening habits so that you're forced to reckon with the sort of basics of the style and the sound here.
Whatever you say, Will.
All right, 2 Truths and a Lie. Here is excerpt number 1. And here is excerpt number 2. And here is excerpt number 3. guys, what are you hearing? What do you think? Two truths and a lie.
These are just observations, but I loved the heavy Petrushka vibe in number 2.
Talk more about like what makes something sound like Petrushka.
There's a lot of what we call ostinato rhythms, which is basically a repeated kind of cell or figure that's kind of repeated all the time. And then the use of the xylophone too, I think in that excerpt, it just seemed very Petrushka-like. I don't know.
But if we're talking about, I mean, Petrushka, obviously written by Stravinsky, who is not an American composer. However, I do think that excerpt was American.
The one that maybe what I was leaning toward picking as the lie was excerpt 3.
Yeah, same. I don't know why it reminded me of some march music that I think of as kind of Russian in a way. Like I heard Prokofiev.
Yeah, I was thinking like Tchaikovsky like ballet music, those fanfares that happen in interludes. That's kind of what it reminded me of.
Mm-hmm. And I know that it, like, I had right at the beginning sort of tickle of something else that I think is Prokofiev, but I can't quite put my finger on what it was.
I think if Will were to throw us a curveball, though,
that's what he'd do.
Like number 1, because number 1 to me in terms of the harmonies and the kind of voicings, like the way the instruments were arranged, it was kind of quintessentially American in terms of like these the openness that we talk about. I imagine that to be, it was almost like John Williams, like Olympic fanfare-esque kind of sound. So, I mean, this is where, like, if Will is being evil, that might be the one that's kind of like, well, it's so obviously American, but maybe it's a surprise. I'm playing the game as if I'm organizing it, so.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble of this is also that, most American classical music has been composed within the last century, simply because before that there was neither the infrastructure nor the impetus behind the production of classical music in the way that there has been. And it's also in the last century, whether this is a kind of causal or related or not, but that we have had the benefit of retrospective, like looking over history. So even though we identify those open chords and these kinds of, that brassy sound, John Williams, the kind of suspended cymbal roll, etc., as quintessentially American, these are also things that most other composers in most other places could very easily do. Right. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all if you told me that first example was composed by somebody in Japan. I choose to play this game without trying to get into the heads of whoever's constructing it.
All right, so final answers.
3.
Yeah, let's do 3.
You guys are both right. It is number 3. Yeah, okay. Nothing gets by you. You guys, you thought this through exactly as I would have, I think. The first piece is called A Festival Prelude. It's by Alfred Reed, who is like the most white bread, square, straightforward 1950s band American composer. He has all of these pieces that like every high school band across the country will play. The second piece is a more contemporary work. It's by a composer who writes mainly for wind ensemble, but has written for orchestra and stuff. It's somebody whose music I quite like. His name is Frank Ticheli.
Oh,
does that name mean anything to you?
Yeah. He's written actually a couple of really good conducting texts. Like I don't generally read conducting texts because they're insufferable, and I find his writing on conducting quite good.
Yeah, that piece is called Wild Nights. So I believe it's a reference to Emily Dickinson. And of course, it had a little bit of jazziness, a little bit of kind of Gershwin-esque kind of riffing and rhythms. The final piece, any guesses on the country of origin or the composer for the non-American piece?
Well, we were saying Russia. So
you guys are right. It is Russia. Any guesses for the composer? You were really close. Neither of you mentioned this person's name, but you guys were very, very close.
Is it Rimsky?
No, but that is... I mean, like if I were devious and it was a guess the composer game, that would have been such the perfect guess. It's 20th century.
Okay, it's 20th century. What we have Shostakovich.
Ding, ding, ding. Stop right there.
Yeah?
Yeah. This is the March of the Soviet Militia. Opus 139.
Can you imagine if we picked that as American?
I know. You guys would be in big, deep doo-doo. Yeah. Well, anyway, guys, fantastic job on this. You sussed it out right away. And I should say that just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to mention a special opportunity for our listeners. If you mention your love for the Classical Gabfest on social media or in an email to your classically inclined friends, tag or CC us, and you'll be entered for a chance to come on the show and participate in one of our Prelude games. It's a win-win. You get the fun of a musical listening challenge, and more people get to enjoy our wonderful show. And with that, we're going to move on to our interviews. And what we have done is we asked our 3 guests each to choose 2 works that they felt represented American music, one of their own and one of somebody else's. Kensho, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your interview subject, Jennifer Higdon, and what you guys talked about?
So Jennifer Higdon is a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, winner of multiple Grammys. I've gotten the chance to work with her on a number of occasions, conducting some of her works and also assisting on some of the world premieres of her works as well. So I've gotten to know her really well. And so this was kind of a natural interview that I got to have with her about where she sees herself as a composer in terms of, does she identify herself as an American classical music composer. And also we talked about some of her inspirations coming from Copeland and how that has translated to one of her most widely performed works, Blue Cathedral. We also talk about her use of interesting instruments in the orchestration of Blue Cathedral, including Chinese medicine balls and also wine glasses that have been filled with water to a certain pitch, just like you would when you're playing around at your dinner table for Thanksgiving.
Fantastic. Well, let's give it a listen.
So we brought you on to talk about American music, and I think the goal for this is to really discover or discuss what is American classical music and how do we classify that. And so my first question to you is, do you think of your music as representing American classical music?
Oh, I do. And, it's kind of funny. For a long time, I couldn't articulate why this was the case. I think so many reporters said to me, your music sounds so American, that I started thinking, well, what does that mean? But one of the explanations I think I've heard Ned Rorem say is that it's American because an American wrote it. So I thought, well, that's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. But the fact of the matter is, I think my music sounds American, and I think it has something to do with the rhythm. I think that's the big thing. Rhythm, and every composer, I think, writes with phrasing and rhythm that reflects their spoken language. So, and I know I grew up on rock and roll, so there's got to be some sort of sense of, clear timing pulse or something. But I have to admit, I find a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, and then when we think about the great diversity that we have in this country, when you go from one state to another, and you've done quite a bit of traveling all over the country, the concept of American music, I think, changes within the country itself, which is also really interesting.
I know, and it also, that carries through in different genres as well. There are different types of country music. There are different kinds of rap music, different kinds of rock. So it probably, the fact that we have access to so much music because of the web, I'm sure that's also altering our concept. Maybe it's becoming more universal or something. It'd be interesting to revisit this question in 10 years and see if our observations have changed at all.
Yeah. And that brings me to it's a really good segue to my second question, which is this concept of like nationalism in music. So it's very much a romantic invention. We think about, Dvorak and Sibelius and the Big Five in Russia. Does this notion still retain any kind of, worth nowadays?
And I think the thing is, it's harder to answer now because it's evolving so quickly. And because we all hear so much music, the variety of music that we get now is huge. It really is reflected in the contemporary classical music scene. Because the fact is, for a long time, people only wrote in one style, one language. But now there are so many different styles. And I think musicologists and theorists are figuring out where we are now. They're still drawing the map of where we've walked in this world. And we're still trying to figure out, is it nationalistic? And what makes it nationalistic? Because we used to say, oh, yeah, well, it uses folk songs. But, the Rite of Spring has Russian folk songs in it. Most people often don't know that. But
right, it's not necessarily associated with Russian nationalistic music.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So maybe it depends on who labels it.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask, is maybe perhaps this is much more of like an outward looking in. And I think it's interesting that, even my own experience as a conductor, when people write what I am or who I am, it's Japanese American conductor, whereas I think I would just call myself an American conductor. You know what I mean? Like the fact that I was born in Japan is important, but I completely identify as an American, you know? So it's a very interesting kind of concept that I think outwardly and look, people around us or whatever it is, critics will write it this way. So that's really an interesting thing, and I think I like your idea of maybe revisiting how it all looks 10, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, because it'll be completely different. And somebody will have come along and labeled it, and that label will have been accepted. And then we'll be reading about it, and we'll be, oh, is that really what it was?
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's talk about your first piece that you've brought for the GabFest. This is a piece that I guess has inspired you, and you still kind of draw inspiration from it. And maybe it was your first kind of aha moment in listening to this piece.
Yes, this is the Copeland Appalachian Spring. And there's an interesting story behind this because when I was young, probably when I was in my teens, I was not around classical music very much, but one day my dad, who was an artist who worked at home, had the radio on. It was the local classical station coming out of the University of Tennessee. And we lived right at the base of a mountain. And I remember it was playing in his studio. I came into that side of the house, and I realized suddenly I was looking out of the window in the dining room at the mountains, and I thought, wow, that music sounds like the Appalachian Mountains. I literally thought that. I'm like, what is that? I had never heard it before. And they got to the end of the piece, and they did a back announcement. They said, that's Copeland's Appalachian Spring. And I thought, oh, wow, it sounds so much like an Appalachian sort of scene. It wasn't until later when I was in school that I discovered that when Copeland wrote that, he had no idea that's what it was going to be. He was writing a piece on commission, but it was not, I think he was just, the original version was a chamber piece, basically. Right. It was at 12 or 13 instruments, and he wasn't thinking about that, but I was so struck by it that it really kind of took me off guard. And I went back and like got the recording, and I was like, this is classical music. So my experience for classical music was through that piece, because that was kind of like a doorway opening. But there's something about the open sounds of that work that sounds to me like prairies. It's probably not what Copeland was thinking at all. He was probably thinking about writing some musical themes and getting them all to work together. But, using the shaker tune that he uses, there's something about that, the American folk element, because it comes out of a tradition of a group of people who were known for, I want to say, appreciating things, but also appreciating art and simplicity. They make furniture and they wrote songs, and there's just something about it that sounds American. That piece always makes me feel like I'm smelling mountain air. I feel like I can sense what it was like in East Tennessee in the spring, staring at the mountains, basically.
And just the incredible range of moods and characters in that piece is also great. One of my favorite moments is just after the shaker melody is passed, he writes this wonderful kind of hymn chorale for the strings, and he writes like a prayer. And I think this is one of the most beautiful moments in all of music.
I totally agree with you. You know what? It actually is like a moment where everything stops and it breathes. And anyone who's listening, I suspect, is probably experiencing the same breathing moments at that end. It is like a prayer. I have to admit, I didn't realize that. I haven't looked at the score in a while.
Maybe this ties in well to then one of your own pieces. Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about Blue Cathedral?
Blue Cathedral is, for me, I guess it's a very personal piece in general, but I think it also grew out of my sense of wonder about life. And a lot of that, I think, for me is also just based in nature because of the time I lived in East Tennessee and would hike in the Smoky Mountains. So there's an awareness of light. I was forever staring at the mountains, and as the weather systems would come through, and I would marvel at how you could see a rainstorm coming at a distance and how that smelled incredible. Same with hiking through the Smokies. I used to spend a lot of time with my younger brother, Andrew, on our farm, just exploring things, fishing down in a pond. It was like a 30-minute walk, listening to whippoorwills at night. It was an incredible, the sound world that basically you have in the mountains. And maybe it's why I like the Copeland Appalachian Spring. But when I went to write this piece, it was a commission for Curtis's 75th anniversary. My intention had been to write something that was more fanfare-ish, but I started this project like a year after losing my younger brother to cancer. So it was in a certain way, I think I was grieving, but getting it down on the page and pondering what is life? What is the journey that we all experience? It's a little bit like Appalachian Spring in that it's not a symphony. It doesn't fall in a traditional form. It's kind of through composed, but you are going on a journey through the piece. So for me personally, I remember thinking, what is life going to be like after losing a younger brother? Is this going to be about living or is this going to be about dying? I remember really pondering that. My heart was heavy. But by the time I got to the end of it, when I got to the brass fanfare, I realized that it was about living, that's actually what it was, and that we need to make the most of the time we're here and kind of grasp it, hang on to it. I remember I was trying to replicate the sound of stars because I had imagined coming in at the beginning of the piece as if you were floating in the sky in a cathedral and that you would fly up towards the ceiling and then the ceiling would disappear and you'd go off into the stars. And I was thinking, how would you replicate that in an orchestra performance? And I think I was staring out the window here in Philadelphia and I had bumped up on a table that had this box of bells on it someone had given me, and I thought, wow, that's a great sound. And I thought, could you get an entire orchestra playing those things? And I thought, that would be cool. I wonder what that would sound like. And the truth is, you make an educated guess when you're a composer. You don't know how it's going to sound. You don't know how difficult it's going to be logistically. And so I put it in thinking, well, this will be interesting to hear at the premiere at the Academy of Music coming from the stage. But it was kind of magical because it's a very gentle sound and no one expects that coming from an orchestra.
Absolutely. And when you were just talking about stars, I've always imagined that kind of glow of the sound that starts growing from the orchestra, from the wine glasses and the Chinese medicine balls, as the kind of the ring of light that you see when you see a star far away, and there's a little bit of kind of light diffusion. And that's what I imagine every single time I hear that ambiance in that piece. My final question for you is a little bit about what we've already talked about, but do you feel like you are creating the American landscape, in terms of the soundscape perhaps?
Some of my pieces, I think, sound like they're distinctly American, and some of them maybe veer in other directions. And I never think about this stuff overtly because my focus is constantly the instrument or the soloist I'm writing for or the ensemble. I just had a string quartet premiere, and it sounded very American to me, but I don't know if it sounded that way to other people. But my biggest concern always, KENSHO, when I'm writing is that the music, my focus has to be the music is the best that it can be, that it's engaging no matter what it sounds like. I guess my considerations and the things I ponder are how to make the music communicate. It literally is something that simple, and I'm sure it all comes out sounding American, but I'm never thinking of it that way.
You know, just listening to that, the ending of that piece, I noticed something for the first time that I've never noticed before, and I've played that piece and I've conducted it, and I really love it, which is that in context of thinking about Appalachian Spring and the part that, KENSHO, you were talking about as your favorite, which is also my favorite part, the Like a Prayer, the hymn finale, that's like the same, that you can hear such a connection. I mean, between these final string chords, it's like the Copeland, but with Chinese medicine balls glistening and glimmering underneath. I thought that was super cool.
Yeah, and even the overall arc of the piece, if you're thinking about the suite, the Appalachian Spring suite, it's kind of the same in the layering of voices that Jennifer uses at the top, that we kind of talked a little bit too about the flute and clarinet solos that represent her and her brother at the very beginning, I thought was pretty poignant.
Yeah, and the clarinet being such the key instrument in Appalachian Spring too. Yeah, you can really see the connection there.
I wanted to ask you guys a question because I just picked up on even my own interview, just like, this is an interesting thing that she said that most composers incorporate the rhythm of their own spoken language into their compositional voice. What do you guys think about that? Is that true?
It would surprise me if it were not true to a degree. I'm not sure that I think that, every composer has like a conscious or unconscious kind of integration, but like I do think that that's not a surprising observation to make about a lot of composers. I mean, I would say it's probably a stretch to say that, all composers have this sort of like unconscious bias in their music where they represent their language. Like that seems like a little too poetic universe to me.
Well, thank you again to Jennifer Higdon for joining me for this interview. Very insightful. Will, let's talk about your interview.
Yeah, I interviewed somebody who I know, a composer named DAMIEN Jeter. And whereas Jennifer Higdon is certainly a very established composer with an international reputation, DAMIEN is just starting to come to national attention. And I think it's something that I and he are very excited about. DAMIEN is not only a composer, but he's also an opera singer. He's a fantastic bass baritone. And so it came as no surprise that one of his choices was an opera. He chose Porgy and Bess for his American-sounding piece from music history. And then for his own piece, he chose a brand new string quartet that he's written called Neo Soul. Now, the interesting thing is that in choosing Porgy and Bess, when we were talking about what he wanted to pick, he said that he had some mixed emotions about that choice. There were reasons that he wanted to pick it, but then there were reasons that he didn't. So that's how the interview starts off.
I've done Porgy and Bess a couple of times now, and when I do it as a singer, I always feel mixed emotions because it was written by a white man. The librettist was a white man. It is a Black story told through a white lens, and so it is their interpretation of what Black life is. But at the same time, I feel like Gershwin did his homework because some of those moments in Porgy and Bess are phenomenal. And when I think about American music, I think about Black people because Black music is the backbone of every type of music, especially in this country. And so I when you think about jazz and gospel, back to spirituals, even R&B, blues, I mean, those are the roots of a lot of forms of music in the United States. And so to me, I think Gershwin did a good job of capturing, elements of jazz and spirituals and things like that in Black life. However, I still feel some type of way, speaking of my quartet, I feel some type of way about the fact that he's a white dude who wrote this. I don't think he could write that same piece today.
Yeah, why not?
Just given the conversations that we have about identity and gender and who can tell whose stories and cultural appropriation and things of that nature, I just don't think that he would be able to do that today.
Do you think that the motive of the artist affects whether or not, like let's say let's say somebody's writing outside of their cultural sphere. Do you think the motive of the person matters in terms of the reception?
Yeah, I think the motive matters. I think if you have a genuine interest, concern, care about a certain topic or something like that that's related to a culture different than your own, I think that's different than, you know what, I'm going to write this piece about Harriet Tubman, just because I think Harriet Tubman was great. And I'm not going to put anything truthful about Harriet Tubman in there. I'm just going to write this piece about Harriet Tubman. I think that's wrong. Whereas if somebody else wants to write a piece about Harriet Tubman, but they have, very strong reasons as to why they want to write it, besides the fact that they just really like the story of Harriet Tubman. Say they want to, if there's a message or something like that they want to convey to other people, I think it's completely different.
Do you think that it has anything to do with, there's this term of art, the direction of the vectors of oppression? Do you think that matters? Like, do you think it's different for a member of a disenfranchised or historically disenfranchised minority or group to quote unquote punch up or to write, about the oppressor versus the oppressor or the historical oppressor writing about members of a minority group or a historically oppressed group? Do you think that the direction matters?
I do. I think that's different. Yeah. Just because of the history of this country and where the power comes from, it's usually, top down.
Yeah.
And so I think given that history alone, I think it does make it different.
So let's now talk specifically about the excerpts that you've chosen. We're talking about the opening of Act 3 of Porgy and Bess. So this is after the hurricane has come in and people are sort of mourning. They're waking up to a new day. They're trying to figure out how to go on with their lives. Why did you choose this as your representative of American music? What sounds American about it to you?
It's the spiritual aspect. There are times when I'm doing Porgy and Bess and I'm on the stage and I really, really feel like I'm putting on like a minstrel show. Like, for example, there's I Got Plenty of Nothing.
Yeah.
It just feels like I'm putting on a show, you know what I mean? But this moment is so beautiful. I think it captures the essence of what this community was feeling like after the death of Jake and Clara, and the emotions and the sort of looking to God and just the spiritual aspect of the sound of the choir. It's the most beautiful moment, I think, in the opera. And to me, it's the most American sound because, again, I go back to this notion that it stems from Black music. And, if you just change kind of the elements that are around this thing, it could be a gospel song, it could be an R&B song. If you speed it up and put something else around it, it could be a rock and roll song. I mean, it's a phenomenal part of the show. I think it's probably my favorite part of the show. Jesus is walking on the water.
All right, so now let's talk about your piece that you selected. This is a brand spanking new piece, hot off the press. It's your first string quartet, Neo Soul, a piece in 3 movements. It was commissioned by Oregon Public Broadcasting, by All Classical Portland, the radio station. And, I asked you to pick one of your pieces that you thought was the most American sounding. And this is what you chose. So explain why. Of your oeuvre, this is the one that jumped out to you.
It was hard for me to pick, and I picked it because, when I was interviewed for this, I talked about the music Neo Soul, and I talked about Erykah Badu, Jill Scott, Raphael Sadiq, and these folks. And when you think about soul music, you think about James Brown and folks like that. And to me, they are so American. They're just as American as Elvis, who stole a lot of music, P.S. by the way. They're just as American as any white artist who's been alive or contributed to the song rap in the United States. And I chose that movement because when I think about my own upbringing, I listened to a lot of R&B. I listened to a little bit of everything, but mostly it was R&B, it was hip hop, it was classical too. And that to me is a part of being an American because that's what I grew up with. And so I incorporated or tried to incorporate some of those grooves and some of those sounds that I remember growing up and even as an adult into that movement. And so that to me makes it my most American to date.
Do you think of Americanness and like an American sound being something that you can dial up and dial down? Or is anything that you write automatically an American sounding piece of music because you're an American?
I think that's it.
Yeah.
I was having this discussion with Anthony Davis, and I was, writing this opera, American Apollo, for Washington National Opera. And I was like, yeah, I'm really trying to capture an American sound. And he was like, well, what does that even mean? And I said, I have no idea. I wanted to capture in an American impressionistic sound is what I wanted to do. And I was like, okay, I don't even know what that means. But I think I will get that sound just by the fact that I'm American.
Mm-hmm.
And, the influences of my life are mostly American music. I think whether I know it or not, I am creating some sort of American sound.
So here's here's kind of a biographical question for you. I mean, so you talk about the different kinds of music that you grew up with, and classical was among those. And yet you seem to have been attracted to a career in classical music as opposed to a career in, say, neo-soul or funk or gospel. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you have a parallel career in those fields too. But what was it about classical music and classical composition that made you think, yeah, this is the path that I want to pursue?
I don't know what the answer to that is, except for the fact that I love going to orchestral concerts. I think it's the acoustic element of it all that you don't get in R&B and things like that. It's sort of that live performance acoustic element for me that really stands out. And I think that's the thing that attracts me most. And I love the way an orchestra sounds. I mean, there's nothing like it. And I think that the variety that you can get out of an orchestra is phenomenal. I think there's a creative aspect as well that goes along with it. I feel like if I were a composer who composed like songwriters write songs, I don't think my career would be as good. And I think that has to, and I'm not taking anything from creativity of songwriting, because yes, I do know that exists. But to me, there's like this little extra layer of something, and that's the thing that I think attracts me to classical music.
I was taken by the fact that he's obviously really considered, even from his ambivalence in including Porgy and Bess as one of the pieces. I think this is someone that has clearly thought a lot about where they stand in terms of who they are as a composer, who they are as an artist, if they consider themselves American, what is all the questions that we want to ask. This is someone that has really put a lot of thought into it. And it's not like he has the answers, but it certainly made for a really good discussion.
Kensho, you noted in your interview that the nationalism in music, or kind of identity that is tied to a certain geographic or ethnic identity, like you say, it's a relatively recent invention, we'll say, that came about basically in the Romantic era. And yet there's this idea that whatever music that a composer composes is inherently expressing that identity just by virtue of their being from that place. I'm not gainsaying either side of this, but I don't know that I necessarily agree with either one, right? I can see, obviously, like, many composers would desire to create and write from a point of view that they thought of as humanistic, speaking for the whole human race, or like delving at some sort of deeper truth. And then there's going to be, and I think that we are seeing the pendulum swing in one direction right now, which is that music expresses your identity, and your identity is a collection of these other sub-identities. That each individual is a sort of collection of those things, and a very large part of that conversation now and here is race.
Yeah, I think that connects actually to something that Jennifer Higdon was talking about when she said that give it 10 years and the answer is going to be slightly different, because musicologists are always sort of catching up to what creative artists are doing. So creative artists are responding to the past and the present, and they're sort of creating the future by doing that. So Tiffany, as you say that right now the conversation is so much focused around racial identity, but in 10 years, the conversation about which identities are most forward might, in fact, be different.
And there's a revisionist aspect of this as well that Jennifer was talking about, which is that, or actually, Kensho, you were talking about it, which is that, what you decide in the moment is important to you may not ultimately be historically what gets decided is the most relevant for the time, of the musicologist who is analyzing it or what have you.
Yeah, Tiffany, I think that's a fantastic transition to your interview. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about JEROD, who he is, and what you guys talked about.
Yes. So the composer that I talked to, whom I did not know beforehand, but we had a great conversation. His name is JEROD IMPICHCHAACHAAHA TATE, and he is a member of the Chickasaw Nation. He's based in Oklahoma, and he has devoted his whole career to the development of the American Indian musicosphere. So he's had commissions done by National Symphony in Detroit, and he has a great recording that's out with the San Francisco Symphony and Chorus. Apropos of that recording, I started off our conversation talking about a quote that was written about the piece on that recording. And the quote is that Tate's connection to nature and the human experience was quite apparent in this piece. Rarer still is his ability to effectively infuse classical music with American Indian nationalism. And we use this as a sort of springboard. JEROD was really kind of touched by how on the spot that analysis of his identity as a musician and a composer was. Just a heads up to our listeners, at the beginning of the piece that JEROD introduces from his own oeuvre, which is a excerpt from a piece called Loach Chopala. There you'll hear some poetry that's being read, and the thing to note is that it's being told from the point of view of a raccoon. Let's take a listen. I think of like the Romantic nationalist movements in the 1800s, and when people started to sort of really try and express their national identity through their music. And what does that mean for us as Americans in particular, and for you in particular as a Native American?
I love that idea, and it is actually quite, it saturates our history, because nationality and ethnicity are very, very hand in hand, and that's how I see that. I know that it's interpreted in different ways, and it has become more complex, but to me it's actually quite simple. When I think of composers in history like Tchaikovsky, who was very nationalistic, and it's because he was very ethnic as a Russian. And when you get political about it, the state ended up mandating to their own composers, you will be nationalistic composers. Right. And so that was definitely complicated for them. But inside of them, they were ethnically very, very Russian. And you know what's so beautiful about that is that all of those composers were extremely different versions of Russian ethnicity and nationality, and but yet they were all Russian. Russia itself, and of course when it became the Soviet Union, it became even more complex, but Russia itself is incredibly complex. So every part of the world is like that. Indian country is very much the same way. When you are looking at American Indians alone, you're looking at over 300 tribes, and we're from very diverse regional cultures, and within those regional cultures it breaks down to different tribes and communities and everything like that. So anyway, to me the word nationalism and ethnicity is a very joyous and interesting and fun topic, because I think it brings up all kinds of really, really cool nuances about human identity.
Yeah, as long as we're talking about kind of the multiplicity of identities within the, what maybe a lot of folks might just know as the more monolithic figure of American Indians culture. Tell us a little bit about specifics of the Chickasaw identity as it sets you apart from the rest of the other members of this nation.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do that. And in fact, I'll go ahead and start out, and I'll go ahead and introduce myself to the audience in my language. And so I will start out by saying, Chokma, Chin Chokma Ta Hatak, Soholchifo, JEROD, IMPICHCHAACHAAHA, TATE, Chikashasaya, Hashlaka Sayopa, Chokmashki, Yakoke. And what I just said was, hello, everyone. My name is JEROD IMPICHCHAACHAAHA TATE, and I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. It's very happy to be here around all of you. And I'm a professional classical composer, and I do identify as a Chickasaw classical composer. Chickasaw people are originally from the northern Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama area. And we are part of a larger cultural region called the Muskogean culture, which includes the Cherokees and Creeks, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Natchez. And we were removed from the southeastern United States into Oklahoma in the early 1800s. So we are a woodland Indian culture from the United States, and so we have very specific type of culture that's different than what you would notice in the plains or the Southwest or the Northwest coast. So the United States has about 6 major American Indian cultural regions where our languages and cultures are very similar. By and large, woodland culture in the United States, which I'm talking east of the Mississippi, has a lot of continuity. One is, like, for instance, stomp dancing and shell shaking is our dancing and percussion. So instead of what people are very familiar with powwow drumming from the plains, we are shell shakers. And so we use turtle rattles for our percussion. And we have stomp dancing, which is where you dance in a circle around a fire, and the women have bundles of turtle shells on their legs, their lower legs, and they shuffle those and create like a 16th note rhythm with the shell shakers, while there's the men will sing and do a call and response type of style. And when stomp dancing goes on, traditionally it's an all-night event, and so you can imagine gals are wearing about 25 pounds of these on each leg. The responsibility for that percussion for women is very, very intense. And it's just beautiful. It's incredible. So women have a very, very specific role of creating that incredibly beautiful wash of shell shaking sound of our percussion. It's magnificent.
I read in an interview you're talking about sound icons, like the way that we sort of have particular visual icons that cue, what to us is just generally Native American culture. Would this shell shaking that you were describing count in your world, in your composition, as sort of one of those aural icons?
Entirely, absolutely. In fact, I have lots of shell-shaking types of moments in all of my symphonic works. I will put in my sound icons in my music mostly through the percussion sections, and I will do imitations through different woodwind and string and brass treatments as well. A lot of the singing actually of our tribe will come out through the woodwinds of the orchestrations, and the strings will do all kinds of different colorings. But yes, we do have sound icons just like visual art does. So if I'm using a modern canvas of a symphonic orchestra that is not Aboriginal to my culture, and I use that because it's incredibly expressive, and the possibilities are just fabulous. And so I'm constantly abstracting and giving impressions of my culture through symphonic writing.
This, provides an interesting avenue into our first selection today. JEROD, you sent me a piece that I believe was actually written by one of your first mentors. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Don Erb was my composition teacher at the Cleveland Institute of Music, and he started teaching there in 1953. And Don Erb was a phenomenally dramatic and expressive symphonic American composer. He just became just a beautiful mentor and friend in my life, and I love his expression, and I love the permission that he gave me to just be JEROD full tilt, and I'm so grateful for that. So this piece that is a movement from a piece that he wrote called Ritual Observances. This is called Genesis Thunder. It's the third movement of this work. It's like his scherzo movement, and this is conducted by Leonard Slatkin and recorded with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. My personal perspective is that American classical and music in general resonates innovation. It really, really does. And, the United States has been like that ever since it's been formed. And, it's very congruent to Indian country as well. I am very proud of my tribe and my cousins' tribes around the country history of adaptation and innovation. I mean, we do it in spades, and I am so proud of it. And it really comes out in fashion. For instance, beads are not Aboriginal to us, and we adapted those, and now we are world famous beaters. We'll beat a car if we are asked to. We'll beat anything. To me, that state of innovation and adaptation is very congruent to the American Indian spirit. And also, I mean, look, this is, to me, it's very obvious, but American history is American Indian history.
Yes.
And our ethos and our personalities highly affected the personality of the United States. I mean, and I'm very proud of that. And so in a sense, I look at the U.S. as our adopted son in many, many ways. So to me, a lot of American innovation is like that. And so Don Erb is a very good example of this larger than life. That is not European.
Yeah, and I think that characterization is so apropos to the piece that you sent, which is the clans movement from a piece called MIXTAPE. Because I feel like this movement in particular breaks so many of those boundaries, or kind of checks many of the boxes that you were just talking about.
I appreciate that. I do agree. MIXTAPE is kind of a microcosm of that. It's about a 15-minute work entirely, but it's one movement of a larger theatric work that includes narration, singing, dance, both modern dance and traditional Chickasaw dancing, and full orchestra. So when I was commissioned by the American Composers Forum to compose this work, they asked me, would you work with your community? I said, absolutely. And so my immediate vision that I pitched to the tribe was, I'd like to do a piece that represents different aspects of Chickasaw history and culture. And this particular one takes you way back to ancient times of clans, politics, and like, so what this is a section in which the very opening is a calling of the Minko, which is our chief, to calling the clan leaders to a tribal council meeting. And then we have many clans, so this is 7 of them that are represented. And then there's poetry in there by Linda Hogan, who is our Chickasaw poet, and she has a poem about each animal clan. And then Richard Ray Whitman is a Yuchi, Indian actor, and he narrated this. And so I just have this full tilt Chickasaw piece about our ancient clans.
O striped tail, masked, intelligent lover of peaches, grapes, and stolen things. We wash our food at the cleansing river. Our long, dark fingers keep busy, and we visit the conjurer at night. That's why we are clever night creatures on the prowl, going through your things. Twigs in our striped fur, eyes hidden, dressed as trees and shadows, looking through the hidden places with another set of eyes.
And in this scene, what happens is as the Minko is on stage calling to the clans in full regalia created by Margaret Wheeler, who is our Chickasaw costume designer and textile artist, in total traditional accurate regalia. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful production.
Yeah.
And the Minko calls, and then as the movements are played, each clan comes through the audience and then joins the Minko up on stage. And then eventually there's the finale where the Minko calls again and kind of sums this whole thing up. And so it's kind of like a slow motion runway show of Chickasaw fashion from the old times. So
Yeah,
it's like
fantastic.
and I got to tell you, it's really cool to wear traditional regalia from thousands of years ago. And I love how it transforms us and our attitude changes when we're putting on that stuff. The ceremony is important.
Yeah.
It really is. And when you're putting on proper ceremonial things and everything like that, it transforms you in all the right ways. Everybody comes from traditions of some kind. You can't avoid it. If you grow up in the world, you're from an environment of some kind. There's something there that's informing you. It's beautiful.
You know, one thing that I thought was interesting in this interview that echoed something that Jennifer Higdon said was that they both talked about traditions as they relate to other art forms. Jennifer Higdon was talking about the furniture that the Shakers make in Appalachia. And here, JEROD was talking about the beadwork that the Chickasaw Nation has taken up and used in their clothing and their regalia. So I love it when we hear that kind of exploration of other art forms and how they relate to a sonic identity.
Yeah, one thing that really came through in this interview for me was that the exploration of that identity was filled with joy. The celebration of it came through in everything that he said, which was something I enjoyed.
Yeah, this idea of going full tilt. He said that twice or three times. I love that. Yeah, and what struck me was his comment, and Will, you touched on it already, about, you know, if you're from any kind of environment, there is a tradition or ceremony that you identify with or you're close to. And usually with those things, music surrounds those ceremonies in some way. And I think that's kind of gives us a nice insight into how ubiquitous and important music is for those traditions to continue. And I think JEROD was someone that really embraced that and again used all those things full tilt in all of his compositions.
So we've had these great conversations with these three American composers about the identity of American classical music, and we hope that that will give you, our listeners, lots of food for thought. But we wouldn't dare let this episode conclude without giving you our own thoughts on American music. So why don't we start with, for our mixtape today, Kensho, would you like to give us your American pick?
I've chosen a piece by the late American composer Christopher Rouse, Iscariot. This is actually quite a dark and intense piece, maybe a soundscape that we don't necessarily associate with American music. But after all of our conversations today, it actually probably fits into the very diverse soundscape that we have in American music.
Yeah, Kensho, you said that we don't necessarily associate this sort of deeply expressionistic soundscape with American music. But the one piece that this Iscariot made me think of is a great American work by Samuel Barber, the Adagio for Strings, this kind of plangent, strident emotionalism ringing out. And that is a piece that I think has become a very American work and something that's associated with American music. So I agree. It's not the first thing that we think of, but I think that we can look to other examples of this kind of expression in our national musical life.
Great. That recording is Marin Alsop with the Colorado Symphony. Will, would you like to take us into your recommendation for this week?
Yeah, I couldn't help myself. When I think of American music, the American classical music, the first person that comes to mind is Leonard Bernstein. And what better work than West Side Story? I mean, we had a little bit of opera reflected because Damien chose Porgy and Bess, but the heart of my American musical experience is with the American musical theater. And, Bernstein is a figure who had dalliances with so many walks of musical life. I mean, he was off conducting the Vienna Philharmonic and he was writing symphonies and concertos and stuff. But, I think that most people know him through his work on the Broadway stage. And in the one of the classic movies of all time, which is the movie that was made out of West Side Story. So I chose The Dance at the Gym because I find it a phenomenal passage of music that tells the story through music. It starts off with this very hard swinging blues, that's like really into the big band sound. And then, of course, the Puerto Rican gang, the Sharks, take over. They kind of take control of the dance, and they do their famous mambo. And then there's the mystical Romeo and Juliet moment where everything stops. The cameras, get grease on the lenses, and all we can see is Tony and Maria. And they have this balletic cha-cha. So here is Bernstein using the jazz vernacular of the day, the Latin music vernacular of the day, and then a nod to European classical tradition, and it's melded all with acting and dance and song, and it's just, to me, it's everything that you could expect from an American piece of music.
I love that part so much, and actually I got a chance to play the live score, live performance of this movie And that was definitely my favorite part. When we got to that moment, I was always rocking out because I don't think the strings play until after that big kind of, brass band number. So I was always enjoying watching the movie and listening to that all happen on stage.
I went a little bit simpler with my pick for this week. So I'm bringing you a piece by William Grant Still. And he was an African-American composer living and working in the, we'll say, early to mid 20th century. And so a lot of his music reminds me a lot of what Dvorak was trying to create in terms of schools of composition when he came to America to help to foment such a school. And so much of his music is right in line with this spiritual aspect that Damien Jeter brought up in his interview. And so he has a couple symphonies that often get played, and I actually thought that I would bring a more simple work. This is a work called Wood Notes. It's a 4-movement orchestral suite, pretty short, about 16 minutes in total. This is the first movement. It's called Singing River. I think this piece is exactly proportional to what he is trying to say with the source material. And that's why I love it. Because, when we're talking about a symphony based on folk tunes, there is an aspect of, how far are you going to take this? Can you transform it into something that we want to listen to for 50 minutes? And he does do that in his symphonies. His symphonies are excellent. But I think that the simplicity and straightforwardness of the coloring here, and the result is this very sweet 16-minute work with 4 movements of distinct characters. It's just a really lovely little... it's a great, I think, addition to a program. And also, I wanted to mention that this work was on the concert that I would have performed the week everything got canceled because of Corona in March. So, shout out to all my Wilmington Community Orchestra listeners. That was for you, and I miss you guys.
And that was the Fort Smith Symphony conducted by John Jeter.
You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, happy Thanksgiving, and we'll be with you next week.
Nice improv there.
Shut up.